said the weather was perfect, visibility was clear, he was moving well, and expected to reach the summit by early afternoon. His teammates at base camp were relieved. The previous day had been brutal. Winds, cold, exhaustion. But this morning, everything had turned around. He sounded strong. He sounded like himself. He never came back down. And the thing that makes this particular death on K too different from the ones that make it into documentaries, the falls, the avalanches, the storms that close without warning, is that nothing went wrong in the way you would expect something to go wrong. He felt fine. And that feeling, that specific sensation of being okay, of being capable, of being on top of the situation rather than underneath it, was the most dangerous thing that happened to him on that mountain. Not the altitude, not the cold, not the technical difficulty of the route. The feeling of being fine. Because on K2, at extreme altitude, feeling fine is not a reliable report from your body about your actual condition. It is a symptom. A symptom of a brain that has been so thoroughly compromised by oxygen deprivation that it has lost the ability to accurately report on its own compromise. A brain that is running diagnostic checks on itself and returning green lights across the board, while the actual systems are failing in ways the diagnostic cannot detect. And the climbers who feel the worst on K2, the ones who are nauseated, dizzy, who know something is wrong, who are afraid, those climbers turn around. The climbers who feel fine keep going. And K2 collects them at a rate that the data, when you actually look at it, makes impossible to ignore. Stay with me, because the mechanism behind this is one of the most precisely documented and least understood dynamics in high-altitude medicine. And once you see it clearly, you will understand why K2 has the death rate it has, in a way that no list of summit statistics ever explains. Let's start with a number. 1 in 4. That is approximately the historical death rate on K2 for climbers who reach the summit. Not for all attempts, for successful summits. 1 in every 4 climbers who stands on the top of K2 and turns around to descend does not make it back to base camp. For comparison, Everest's summit-to-death rate is roughly 1 in 9. K2 is more than twice as lethal for climbers who actually reach the top. And a disproportionate number of those deaths share one characteristic that forensic analysis of K2 incidents has identified repeatedly, across different seasons, different nationalities, different levels of experience. The climbers who died reported feeling okay. Not all of them, not as a universal rule, but the pattern is consistent enough that researchers studying high-altitude decision-making have given it a name: false functional reserve. The subjective sense of having more capacity than you actually have. The feeling of being fine, while your actual physiological and cognitive resources are critically depleted. Understanding why this happens, and why it happens specifically to the climbers who are most likely to push to the summit, requires understanding something about how the brain monitors itself. Let's get into the actual mechanism. The prefrontal cortex is the most metabolically expensive region of the human brain. It consumes more oxygen per gram of tissue than almost anywhere else in the nervous system. It is also the region responsible for the functions that matter most on a mountain: risk assessment, future planning, the ability to evaluate your current state against an objective standard rather than just how you feel. When oxygen supply drops, the brain protects its core functions first. The brainstem, which controls breathing, heart rate, basic consciousness, is defended at almost any cost. The limbic system, which handles emotion and motivation, is protected next. The prefrontal cortex is expendable. At blood oxygen saturation levels that are normal on a K2 summit push, somewhere between 55 and 70% compared to a normal of 95 to 100, prefrontal cortex function is measurably impaired. Research using cognitive testing at simulated altitude has shown consistent degradation in executive function, working memory, and critically, metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to think about your own thinking, to evaluate the quality of your own judgment, to notice that you are impaired. At altitude, the very faculty you would use to recognize that you are not functioning well is the first faculty to go offline. And what replaces it is not confusion or fog or obvious disorientation. What replaces it is a false clarity, a sense of sharpness that has no basis in actual cognitive performance, but feels completely real to the person experiencing it. Climbers described this consistently in post-expedition accounts. They described feeling unusually focused, unusually capable, unusually clear-headed at moments when, in retrospect, they were making decisions that made no sense. They felt fine. They were not fine. Now let's add the physical dimension, because the psychological impairment is only half of the picture. At extreme altitude, your body is managing a cascade of physiological responses simultaneously. Blood is thickening from increased red blood cell production and dehydration. Pulmonary vasoconstriction is increasing the pressure load on the right side of the heart. Muscle tissue is being broken down as the body burns through glycogen reserves and begins catabolizing protein for energy. These processes are silent. There is no pain signal attached to blood thickening. There is no alarm that fires when pulmonary pressure rises. Muscle catabolism at altitude produces less of the lactic acid burn that tells you at sea level that your muscles are working beyond their capacity, because the metabolic processes themselves are running differently in the hypoxic environment. The body is deteriorating without announcing that it is deteriorating. And the mind, which would normally catch some of these signals and interpret them correctly, is operating in its own compromised state, where incoming signals are being processed by a system that has lost calibration. The climber at 8,200 meters who feels strong is not imagining it in the sense of fabricating something that isn't there. They are accurately reporting their subjective experience. Their subjective experience has become untethered from their objective condition. This is the core of force functional reserve. And K2 exploits it specifically because K2 demands so much from a climber before they reach the point where this phenomenon kicks in at full force. Let me make this concrete. On August 9th, 2008, K2's single deadliest day in recorded history, 11 climbers from multiple international expeditions died in under 24 hours. The accounts from survivors and from radio communications logged during the incident paint a consistent picture of the hours before the disaster. Multiple climbers who died had communicated that they were managing, that conditions were difficult but within range, that they were tired but okay. Marco Confortola, one of the survivors, described in subsequent interviews the surreal experience of moving through the chaos of that night, watching people die, trying to help, continuing to function, while operating in a mental state that he only fully understood when he came back to altitude to think about it later. He had been making decisions, he said, that felt completely rational in the moment, and that he could not fully reconstruct or explain afterward. He survived. Others who were similarly impaired did not. The difference was not capability. The difference was a combination of position on the mountain, specific decisions made at specific moments, and the randomness that K2 always holds in reserve. But the underlying cognitive state, compromised, unaware of its own compromise, generating confidence it had no basis for, was shared by survivors and victims alike. The mountain does not select for who is actually fine. It selects for who makes the correct decision despite feeling fine when they shouldn't. Now let's talk about something that makes this phenomenon specifically deadly on K2 compared to other mountains. The route. K2's standard route, the Abruzzi Spur, has a section approximately 300 meters below the summit called the Bottleneck. It is a narrow couloir, a steep gully of ice, directly below a massive sérac, a wall of ice the size of a large that hangs above the route and cannot be avoided. To reach the summit, you go through the bottleneck. There is no other way. And the bottleneck changes the psychological calculation in a way that interacts with false functional reserve in a particularly lethal fashion. When a climber reaches the bottleneck and passes through it successfully, navigating the steep ice, clipping through the fixed ropes, moving under the serac, something happens in the brain that feels like confirmation. I made it through the hard part. I'm okay. I can do this. This feeling of having passed a threshold, of having survived the obvious danger, is a known cognitive phenomenon called threshold completion bias. The brain marks a difficult checkpoint as evidence of ongoing capability. On K2, this is exactly backwards. Passing through the bottleneck does not mean the hard part is over. It means you are now at extreme altitude, on the wrong side of the technical crux, with a deteriorating physiological state and a descending sun, committed to a summit and a return through the same dangerous section. The feeling of having cleared the hard part is generated at the exact moment when the situation is actually becoming more dangerous. And a brain impaired by hours of altitude hypoxia, a brain already running on false functional reserve, is not capable of correcting for this bias. It feels the completion. It registers the relief. It interprets these as evidence that continuing is the right call. And it keeps going. I want to ask you something. Think about a moment in your own life where you felt certain you were handling something well, and it turned out you were more compromised than you knew. Not on a mountain. Anything. A deadline, a difficult conversation, a physical effort. How confident were you that you were fine? Drop that in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because I think the K2 dynamic is actually something most people have experienced in a smaller form, and I want to hear how it showed up for you. Let's talk about the turnaround time, because this is where false functional reserve has its most direct and most documented lethal effect. Before any serious summit attempt on K2, guides and expedition leaders establish a turnaround time, a hard deadline, typically between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, at which point, regardless of position on the mountain, climbers must reverse direction and descend. The turnaround time exists for one reason. The math of oxygen, daylight, and altitude does not care how close you are to the summit. If you are not back at high camp by dark, you will die. Every experienced climber on K2 knows this. The turnaround time is violated on almost every expedition that ends in death. And the mechanism of that violation is almost always the same. The climber reaches their turnaround time. They are 200, 300, sometimes 400 meters below the summit. They can see it. The weather is holding. Their body is performing. Not well, not at anything close to sea level capacity, but well enough that they cannot feel the deficit. They feel fine. And the turnaround time, a decision made at base camp by a brain with full oxygen, full executive function, full capacity for future-oriented reasoning, now has to be enforced by a brain at 8,000 meters that has lost exactly those capabilities. The base camp brain knew why the turnaround time was non-negotiable. The summit brain cannot fully access that knowledge. It can remember the rule. It cannot feel the weight of the reasoning behind it the way the base camp brain felt it. What the summit brain can feel is that it is okay, that the summit is close, that it has been in bad situations before and found a way through. The turnaround time feels like excessive caution from down here, and so it gets pushed. By 15 minutes, by 30, by an hour. And K2, which does not negotiate, closes the weather window, or depletes the oxygen, or darkens the sky at exactly the speed it was always going to close, deplete, and darken. The climbers who survive K2 at the highest rates are not those with the most physical capability. They are those who made the turnaround decision unmakeable before they left. The best high-altitude climbers describe a specific mental protocol. Decisions that are made at sea level, written down, shared with teammates, and treated as completely non-negotiable. Not, I will turn around if it feels necessary. That is a decision being made at altitude by a brain that cannot make it correctly. Instead, I will turn around at 12 noon regardless of position. Full stop. This is what psychologists call a pre-commitment device. By making the decision in advance and making it social, by telling your team, your guide, your family, you remove the requirement for in-the-moment judgment. You bypass the brain that will feel fine when it shouldn't. The climbers who used this protocol on the 9th of August 2008, who had set hard turnaround times and kept them despite feeling capable of continuing, are the climbers who came home. Several of them described turning around when the summit was visible, when they felt strong enough to continue, when every signal their body was sending said go. They turned around anyway, because they knew, from sea level, that the signal could not be trusted. Let's close with the question that this raises, and that I think deserves a direct answer. If feeling fine is dangerous, if the absence of obvious distress is actually a warning sign at extreme altitude, what does safe decision-making on K2 actually look like? The answer from the research, from survivor accounts, and from the pattern of who lives and who dies, is uncomfortable. Safe decision-making on K2 requires that you do not trust your own assessment of how you are doing. Not as a metaphor, not as a general principle of humility, as a literal, operational rule. The climbers who have the best long-term survival records on extreme altitude peaks, those who have made multiple 8,000 summits and returned repeatedly, describe a consistent approach. They do not ask themselves how they feel. They check objective markers: time, oxygen remaining, position against a preset schedule, weather data. These are inputs that do not lie in the way subjective experience lies. And when the objective markers say turn around, they turn around, even when they feel fine, especially when they feel fine. Because on K2, feeling fine is not the absence of a problem. It is the problem. All right, you made it to the end. 2 things from me. First, drop a comment telling me which video you want next. I have 3 options. Option 1. Why the body gets warmer right before a climber freezes to death on a mountain. The physiology of paradoxical undressing and why it kills people who think they are recovering. Option 2. What actually happens inside a human lung during the first 2 hours of high-altitude pulmonary edema? Why it feels like nothing until it feels like drowning. Option 3. Why K2's death rate has not improved in 30 years, despite better equipment, better weather forecasting, and better medicine. The structural reason that statistics keep repeating. Type 1, 2, or 3. That determines what I make next. Second, if this gave you something you didn't have before, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it is the most direct way to tell YouTube this